Plain text. The air at 30,000 feet does not just feel cold. It feels like a physical weight, a crushing, crystalline pressure that turns oxygen into a luxury and human breath into a blinding shroud of frost. Inside the cramped, transparent cage of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress tail turret, 19-year-old Michael Arooth is suspended in a realm where the laws of physics and the dictates of military manual are about to collide with a violent, bloody reality. It is July 30th, 1943, and the sky over Kassel, Germany, is thick with the black smudge of flak and the silver glint of predatory wings. Arooth is a high school dropout from Springfield, Massachusetts, a boy who should be worrying about summer dances. Yet here he sits, encased in plexiglass and steel, gripping the twin handles of two .50 caliber Browning machine guns. But there is a problem that would make any other gunner's blood turn to ice. His reflector sight, the sophisticated optical brain of his weapon system, the very thing that is supposed to tell him where to aim in a three-dimensional dogfight, is dead. The glass is dark. The illuminated reticle, the glowing red ring that marks the point of impact, has vanished, leaving him with nothing but a useless tube of metal and a clear view of his own impending death. In the official doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces, a gunner with a broken sight is a liability, a dead man walking in a flying coffin. The manual explicitly states that without the sight, a gunner cannot accurately calculate lead or deflection at high speeds. They are told to wait until the enemy is within 600 yards, essentially waiting until they can see the rivets on the German cowlings before opening fire. But as Michael Arooth stares out into the freezing void, watching a swarm of Messerschmitt Bf 109s bank into an attack formation, he realizes something that the generals in Washington have failed to grasp. In 1943, following the rules is a death sentence. The 8th Air Force is bleeding out, suffering from a fundamental imbalance where the defensive capability of the bombers is being systematically dismantled by the evolving tactics of the Luftwaffe. The German pilots have learned the math of American fear. They know that if they stay beyond 600 yards, the American gunners will hold their fire, allowing the Germans to line up their 20mm cannons for a surgical strike. It is a meat grinder of a strategy, a tactical stalemate where young Americans are being traded for industrial targets at an unsustainable rate. But on this day, over the burning ruins of Kassel, the anomaly occurs. Michael Arooth does not panic when he looks through his broken glass. Instead, he does something that defies every hour of training he received at the gunnery school in Harlingen, Texas. He ignores the manual. He ignores the darkness of his sight. He begins to feel the vibration of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines through his boots, the rhythmic thud of the bomber's heart, and he starts to calculate the geometry of death using nothing but raw intuition and the white-hot tracers of his ammunition. He doesn't wait for the Germans to reach the 600-yard mark. He doesn't wait for the official permission of his training. At 900 yards, a distance where the enemy fighters look like nothing more than tiny, lethal gnats on the horizon, Arooth squeezes the triggers. The recoil of the twin M2s rattles his very skeleton, the smell of cordite and burnt hydraulic fluid filling the tiny turret, as a stream of incendiary and armor-piercing rounds arcs out into the thin blue air. In that moment, Michael Arooth ceases to be a student of the textbook and becomes a predator of the sky. He is about to do the impossible. He is about to shoot down 6 German fighters in a single mission with a weapon system that is technically blind. This is not a story of luck, nor is it a story of a hero who followed orders to the letter. This is the account of a lethal anomaly, a teenage gunner who realized that the only way to survive a broken system was to break the rules himself. As the first Messerschmitt begins to disintegrate under the weight of his long-range fire, the German pilots find themselves facing a new kind of terror, an American who can kill them, before they even think they are in danger. The sky over Kassel is about to become a graveyard for the Luftwaffe, and the highest-scoring aerial gunner in American history is about to be forged in the fire of a broken sight. The mission is just beginning. The frost is thick on the plexiglass, and Michael Arooth is no longer waiting for the red ring of his sight to tell him when to kill. He is listening to the machine, he is watching the tracers, and he is rewriting the history of air defense with every ounce of lead he sends into the abyss. This is the lethal anomaly. This is the day the manual died. To understand the sheer audacity of Michael Arooth's rebellion, one must first grasp the anatomy of the suicide pact that the United States Army Air Forces called official doctrine in 1943. This was the year of the meat grinder, a period where the high-altitude skies over occupied Europe became a laboratory for systematic slaughter, driven by a fundamental imbalance between bureaucratic theory and the jagged, frozen reality of aerial combat. At the heart of this catastrophe was the 600-yard rule, a tactical mandate dictated by armchair strategists who believed that aerial gunnery was a matter of disciplined restraint rather than instinctive survival. The manual was clear. American gunners were to hold their fire until the enemy reached the 600-yard threshold, the logic being that ammunition was precious and the .50 caliber round was most effective at close quarters, where the trajectory was flat and the kinetic energy was peaked. But this was a mathematical delusion that failed to account for the predatory evolution of the Luftwaffe. German pilots were not suicidal. They were engineers of destruction who had spent the early years of the war perfecting the art of the long-range kill. By 1943, the German High Command had equipped their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s with 20mm MG 151 cannons, weapons that could reach out and shatter a B-17's wing spar from nearly 1,000 yards away. This created what veterans called the dead zone, a terrifying tactical gap where the Germans could park their fighters, leisurely align their sights, and pump high-explosive shells into the unarmored bellies of American bombers, while the American gunners sat frozen, bound by a command structure that forbade them from firing back. It was a massacre by the numbers. Every morning, the cold gray air of East Anglia was filled with the roar of 1,200 Wright Cyclone engines as hundreds of young men, most of them barely old enough to shave, climbed into their metal coffins. They were told they were part of a precision bombing machine, a collective organism designed to break the back of German industry, but in reality they were being fed into a process of attrition that favored the defender. The statistics were chilling. In some missions, the loss rate approached 25%, meaning that mathematically, no crew member could expect to survive their 25-mission tour of duty. This was not war as depicted in propaganda posters. This was a grinding, industrial liquidation where the cost of a single ball-bearing factory was paid in the pulverized remains of 18-year-old boys from Ohio and Massachusetts. The leadership in Washington looked at the charts of rising casualties and saw a necessary price for victory. But in the freezing turrets of the 8th Air Force, the men saw a systemic failure. They saw their friends' planes spiral into the clouds and flames, victims of a doctrine that turned their defensive firepower into a decorative ornament until it was too late. The German interceptors would approach from the tail, sitting in that 600 to 1,000 yard sweet spot, firing rhythmic bursts of cannon fire that turned the B-17's aluminum skin into lethal shrapnel. The American gunners would scream into their intercoms, begging for permission to fire, only to be reminded of the manual, of the need to conserve ammunition, of the danger of wasting tracers on long-range shots. Inside the B-17, the atmosphere was a suffocating mix of hydraulic fluid, cordite, and the smell of raw fear, all frozen solid in temperatures that could drop to minus 60 degrees. If a gunner opened his mask to shout, his breath would instantly turn to ice, blinding him. If he touched the metal of his guns with bare skin, he would leave his flesh behind. In this environment, the 60 yards rule was more than a mistake. It was an act of institutional cruelty. The Luftwaffe's Sturmbach tactics were being refined, massive armored fighters designed to ram or blast bombers out of the sky, and they relied entirely on the Americans' refusal to fire early. The German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 2 and 26 laughed at the American restraint, calling the B-17s flying porcupines that had forgotten how to use their quills. This institutional stubbornness was the catalyst for the tragedy Michael Arooth was forced to witness every day. He saw the fire, he heard the screams over the radio, and he realized that the people writing the rules were not the ones dying in the plexiglass cages. The meat grinder was not just a result of German skill, it was a product of American arrogance, a belief that a pre-war textbook could dictate the terms of a total war that was changing every single hour. The imbalance was structural, a deep-seated refusal to admit that the 50 caliber doctrine was a legacy of an era that had already passed. While the propaganda machines in London spoke of the inevitability of Allied triumph, the private understanding among the bomber crews was one of impending doom. They knew the math. They knew the Germans had found the flaw in the machine. And they knew that unless someone had the courage to be an anomaly, to break the cycle of predictable failure, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist before the invasion of Europe could even begin. Michael Arooth was sitting in the tail of a B-17 watching the slaughter unfold, his boots vibrating from the thrum of the engines and his mind racing through the geometry of survival. He began to understand that the only way to save his crew was to commit an act of tactical treason. He realized that the tracers were not just bullets. They were data points in a three-dimensional graph of death. If he could hit a target at 900 yards, he wouldn't just be shooting down a plane. He would be shattering the German pilot's sense of security. He would be reclaiming the dead zone. But to do so, he had to ignore the voices of the officers, the weight of the training films, and the very structure of the military mind. The stage was set for a confrontation not just between two air forces, but between a dying doctrine and a man who refused to become another statistic in the ledger of attrition. The meat grinder was hungry, and Michael Arooth was tired of being the fuel. He was about to turn the system inside out, using his broken sight as the ultimate excuse to stop looking at the world through the lens of a failed manual and start seeing it through the cold, clear eyes of a hunter. In the silence of the high altitude, where the only sound was the rush of the wind and the beating of his own heart, Arooth made a decision that would change the course of air defense forever. He would fire early, he would fire long, and he would let the wreckage of the Luftwaffe provide the only evidence he needed to prove that the experts were wrong. To the bureaucratic machine of the United States Army Air Forces, Michael Arooth was a statistical anomaly that should never have existed, a high school dropout from the industrial grit of Springfield, Massachusetts, who possessed a raw, lethal intelligence that no classroom could cultivate and no manual could contain. In the 1940s, the military prized conformity and the rigid adherence to standardized testing. Yet Arooth was the antithesis of the poster boy aviator. He was a man who saw the world not through the abstract equations of a textbook, but through the visceral, three-dimensional geometry of motion and impact. When he stood on the tarmac of an English airfield in the summer of 1943, he carried with him the quiet, unassuming demeanor of a New England laborer. A man so humble he seemed almost invisible among the swaggering pilots and navigators. Yet beneath that calm exterior lay a hunter's instinct that was about to turn the Luftwaffe's tactical superiority into a pile of smoldering wreckage. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a masterpiece of industrial engineering, but its tail turret was a claustrophobic plexiglass tomb, a lonely outpost at the very end of a metal fuselage where a single man was tasked with defending the entire formation's vulnerable rear. Inside this cage sat the Mark A8 reflector sight, a sophisticated optical instrument designed to project an illuminated red reticle onto a glass plate, allowing the gunner to compensate for airspeed, bullet drop, and target lead with mathematical precision. It was the high-tech brain of the turret, and the Army Air Forces considered it the essential bridge between a human eye and a .50 caliber kill. But as Arooth's bomber crossed the jagged coastline of the English Channel on that fateful July morning, the mechanical betrayal occurred. The light inside the sight flickered once, twice, and then vanished into a cold, dead void. The red ring, the very guide that was supposed to ensure his survival, had been extinguished by a faulty wire or a blown bulb, leaving Arooth staring through a transparent sheet of nothingness as the formation climbed toward the hostile interior of the Third Reich. For any other gunner, this was the moment to notify the pilot, to declare the weapon system inoperable, and to accept a passive role in the coming slaughter. But Michael Arooth was not built for passivity. He sat in the freezing silence, the vibration of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines humming through his flight suit, and he felt a strange, chilling clarity settle over his mind. He realized that the sight had been a crutch, a filter that forced him to see the enemy through the eyes of the men who wrote the manuals in Washington, men who weren't sitting in a vibrating tail turret at 30,000 feet. Without the illuminated reticle, Arooth was forced to rely on what he called tracer geometry, a raw form of ballistic intuition where he used the white-hot streaks of his own incendiary rounds to paint a mental map of the sky. He began to understand that the air was not an empty space, but a fluid medium where every movement left a trail, and every bullet followed a predictable arc of gravity and wind resistance. This was the moment of tactical treason, the point where the Springfield Dropout decided that his own internal calculations were superior to the failing technology of the industrial complex. As the first wave of Messerschmitts appeared as tiny, jagged specks against the horizon, Arooth didn't feel the panic of a man who was blind. He felt the predatory focus of a man who had finally seen through the illusion of the rules. The official doctrine insisted that he wait until the enemy was within 600 yards, a distance dictated by the limitations of the Mark 8 sight's accuracy. But Arooth's mind was already calculating a solution at 900 yards, a range that the Luftwaffe considered a safe zone. He was looking past the broken glass, ignoring the darkness of the optic, and instead watching the way the sunlight glinted off the German wings, estimating the closure rate through the sheer rhythm of his heartbeat. He was a misfit who had found his purpose in the failure of his equipment, realizing that the fundamental imbalance of the air war could only be corrected by someone willing to step outside the boundaries of the expected. In the cockpit of the leading Messerschmitt, the German pilot felt a sense of professional calm, knowing that he had nearly 400 yards of safety before the American tail gunners would begin their disciplined, ineffective bursts. But Michael Arooth was no longer a disciplined soldier. He was a lethal anomaly. He gripped the spade handles of his twin Brownings, feeling the cold metal through his sheepskin gloves, and he didn't wait for the red light that wasn't there. He felt the lead in his gut. He saw the curve of the earth beneath him, and he unleashed a stream of .50 caliber death into a space where the manual said no bullet could find its mark. In that instant, the Springfield Dropout didn't just fire a weapon, he launched a revolution in aerial defense, proving that in the chaos of total war, the most dangerous weapon is not the one with the most advanced optics, but the one wielded by a man who has lost his faith in the system and found his faith in himself. The broken sight was not his downfall. It was his liberation, stripping away the layers of bureaucratic theory and leaving him with the only thing that mattered in the thin, frozen air over Kassel, the ability to kill the enemy before they even knew the fight had begun. This was the beginning of the legend of Michael Arooth, a man who would go on to break every record in the textbook, because he was the only one brave enough to realize the textbook was a lie. Stop. Would you like me to generate prompts for part 3 now, or proceed to another step? Plain text. The sky over Kassel on July 30th, 1943, was not a battlefield. It was a vertical slaughterhouse, a cathedral of fire where the air itself seemed to vibrate with the frequency of impending liquidation. As the B-17 combat box lumbered toward the Fiesler aircraft factories, the 19-year-old high school dropout Michael Arooth sat encased in his plexiglass cage, feeling the sub-zero wind howling through the gaps in his turret, like the breath of a dying god. Below him, the German city was a smudge of gray obscured by the black, oily blossoms of heavy flak. But his eyes were not on the ground. They were fixed on the horizon, where the Luftwaffe was preparing to execute its most efficient process of attrition. This was the moment where the meat grinder reached its peak intensity, a chaotic symphony of screaming engines and shattering aluminum. To the German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 2, the American formation looked like a slow-moving, predictable target, a collection of flying porcupines that were lethal only at close range. They banked their Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s into a high perch position, hanging in the thin blue air at nearly 1,000 yards, a distance they believed to be a sanctuary of tactical immunity. They were engineers of death, leisurely aligning their 20mm cannons, confident that no American gunner would dare waste ammunition on a target so distant. But they did not know about the broken sight in the tail of the B-17 named the Sad Sack. They did not know that Michael Arooth had discarded the manual and replaced it with a raw, predatory instinct for tracer geometry. As the first wave of German interceptors began their dive, leveling out at 900 yards to begin their surgical strike, Arooth did something that defied the very laws of the 8th Air Force. He didn't wait. He didn't pray. He simply felt the rhythm of the formation's vibration and squeezed the spade handles of his twin .50 calibers. The recoil was a violent mechanical seizure that rattled his teeth and filled the tiny turret with the choking metallic stench of cordite and burnt hydraulic fluid. Through the dark, dead glass of his broken sight, Arooth watched the white-hot arcs of his tracers, a lethal handwriting across the sky. At 900 yards, a distance the Luftwaffe considered the safety zone, the first Focke-Wulf suddenly blossomed into a terrifying fireball. The German pilot never even had the chance to fire his cannons. His engine block was pulverized by a concentrated stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds before he even realized he was in the kill zone. The shockwave of the explosion rippled through the air, and for a split second, the German formation faltered, a collective intake of breath in the face of an impossible reality. But Arooth was already moving, swinging his turret with a fluid, violent grace, his mind calculating lead and deflection as if it were a primal language. He wasn't looking for a red reticle. He was watching the way the sunlight flickered off the German wings and lead painting the space where they were going to be. A second Messerschmitt banked hard to the left, trying to escape the unpredictable reach of this mad gunner. But Arooth's tracers followed him like heat-seeking ghosts, stitching a jagged line of fire across the cockpit and tearing the wing spar from the fuselage. The aircraft spun out of control, a trailing smear of black smoke marking its descent into the abyss. This was not a dogfight. It was a systematic liquidation. The German pilots, used to the disciplined restraint of American gunners, found themselves in a state of cognitive dissonance, their tactical manuals rendered obsolete by a single teenager from Massachusetts who refused to follow the rules. By the time the formation reached the bomb release point, the sky was a graveyard of German metal. Arooth's guns were screaming, the barrels glowing a dull, lethal red in the freezing altitude as he claimed his third, fourth, and fifth kills. He was shooting through the dead zone, reclaiming the territory that the Luftwaffe had owned for years. In the waist of the B-17, the other gunners could only watch in stunned silence as the tail turret became a volcano of lead. The sensory overload was total. The deafening roar of the Wright Cyclone engines, the staccato thunder of the machine guns, and the sight of 6 German fighters spiraling toward the earth in various states of disintegration. When the 6th Messerschmitt erupted into flames, its wing clipping the B-17's tail fin, in a final desperate act of proximity, Michael Arooth didn't flinch. He simply reloaded, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of a clockmaker, his eyes already searching for the next speck on the horizon. He had just accomplished the impossible, breaking the record for the most kills by a single gunner in a single mission. And he had done it with a weapon system that was technically blind. As the bombers finally turned back toward England, limping through the flak-filled air with hundreds of bullet holes in their skin, the sad sack was no longer just another plane in the combat box. It was a legend. Michael Arooth sat in the cooling silence of his turret, the smell of spent brass heavy in his lungs, and he knew that the war would never be the same. He had proven that the fundamental imbalance of the air war was not a matter of technology, but a matter of will. He had turned the meat grinder back on its creators, using his broken sight as a gateway to a new kind of warfare, where intuition trumped doctrine. The mission to Kassel was a bloodbath, but for Michael Arooth, it was a confirmation of a terrible truth. That in the chaos of total war, the only way to survive a system designed to kill you is to become the most efficient killer the system has ever seen. The sky was empty now, the German interceptors having retreated in a state of tactical paralysis, leaving the B-17s to crawl back across the channel like wounded ghosts. But in the tail of the lead ship, the lethal anomaly was still watching, his fingers still twitching on the triggers. A 19-year-old boy who had just rewritten the history of air defense with a stream of .50 caliber fire, and the cold, hard logic of a survivor who refused to die by the book. The landing of the B-17 named the Sad Sack back on the rain-slicked runway of its English base was not greeted with the triumphant fanfare of a propaganda reel, but with a heavy contemplative silence that permeated the damp morning air. As the ground crews swarmed over the scarred aluminum skin, counting the hundreds of jagged entry holes and the deep, terrifying gouges where German wings had almost clipped the tail, a group of intelligence officers stood with their clipboards, ready to dissect a story they simply did not believe. In the debriefing room, under the harsh, flickering yellow light of a single bulb, 19-year-old Michael Arooth sat with a mug of lukewarm coffee, his hands still vibrating with a phantom recoil that no amount of rest could settle. When he calmly stated that he had engaged the Luftwaffe at 900 yards and claimed 6 confirmed kills in a single mission, the room went cold. To the polished colonels and the graduates of West Point, this was more than a statistical impossibility. It was a tactical heresy that threatened the very foundations of their carefully constructed world. The investigative process that followed was not merely an attempt to verify his kills, but a desperate effort to understand how a high school dropout from Springfield had managed to outperform the entire industrial military complex's training curriculum. The Pentagon's experts had spent millions of dollars and thousands of hours developing the 600-yard doctrine, a theory based on the calculated dispersion of .50 caliber rounds and the optical limitations of the Mark 8 sight. To admit that Arooth was right was to admit that their system, the very machine that was supposed to protect thousands of American lives, was fundamentally flawed. They cross-referenced his claims with the frantic radio logs of other crews, the blurry footage of gun cameras, and the intercepted reports from the Luftwaffe's own demoralized units. The cold truth began to emerge from the data points. The Germans were indeed losing fighters in a sector they had previously considered a sanctuary. Arooth hadn't just gotten lucky. He had discovered a paradigm shift in the physics of survival. He had realized that air defense was not a passive act of waiting for the enemy to reach a predefined threshold, but an offensive act of psychological and ballistic dominance. By firing at 900 yards, he was reclaiming the dead zone, stripping the German pilots of their most valuable asset, time. The ballistics experts began to analyze what Arooth called tracer geometry, realizing that while the 50 caliber round lost kinetic energy at long range, its psychological impact was devastating. A German pilot, seeing tracers arcing toward him while he was still 300 yards away from his own firing position, would instinctively flinch, break formation, or prioritize evasive maneuvers over his attack run. Arooth had turned the flying fortress from a sitting duck into an apex predator that bit before the prey even knew it was being hunted. This was the moment where the 8th Air Force began the painful, bureaucratic process of rewriting the textbook. The early fire technique was declassified among the upper echelons and whispered among the gunnery schools, gradually replacing the rigid 600-yard rule with a more fluid, aggressive understanding of aerial defense. The legacy of Michael Arooth's July 30th mission was not just the 6 planes he destroyed, but the hundreds of B-17s that stayed in the air because their gunners started firing sooner, harder, and with a newfound disregard for the manual. This shift was a catalyst for a broader transformation in military thought, moving away from the pre-war delusion of disciplined restraint toward the cold, hard reality of attrition warfare, where the only metric that mattered was the liquidation of the enemy's capacity to fight. But for Arooth himself, the investigation was a burden he never wanted. He watched as his instinctive rebellion was sanitized into a set of bullet points for future trainees. His raw, bleeding experience converted into a clinical set of instructions. The military machine, in its typical fashion, sought to own his anomaly, to standardize his genius so it could be mass-produced, but they could never replicate the Springfield Dropout's internal monologue, the silent, high-altitude realization that the system was lying to him. The shift from defensive survival to offensive dominance marked a turning point in the air war, a transition where the Luftwaffe began to realize that the fundamental imbalance they had exploited for years was being corrected not by a new weapon, but by a change in the American soul. The German pilots of Jagdgeschwader 2 and 26 no longer laughed at the flying porcupines. They feared them, knowing that any American tail gunner might be another Michael Arooth, watching them from 1,000 yards away with a broken sight and a heart full of cold, calculating fury. This was the diabolical irony of total war. The most significant innovation didn't come from the laboratories of the industrial giants or the minds of the strategic geniuses in D.C., but from the freezing cage of a tail turret, where a 19-year-old boy decided that the rules were meant for people who intended to die. As the war dragged on toward its inevitable conclusion in 1945, the Arooth factor became a silent constant in the skies over Germany, a shift in the geometry of death that played a silent role in the eventual collapse of the Third Reich's aerial defenses. The experts eventually stopped asking how he did it and started teaching everyone else to do the same. But the true insight remained hidden in the files, that in a machine-driven conflict, the human element remains the ultimate variable, the only thing capable of breaking a cycle of systemic failure through an act of inspired, lethal defiance. When the global machinery of industrial slaughter finally shuddered to a halt in May 1945, and the deafening roar of 1,200 Wright Cyclone engines was replaced by the hollow, haunting silence of a broken Europe, Michael Arooth did something that defied the expectations of a nation hungry for heroes. He vanished. The 19-year-old high school dropout from Springfield, Massachusetts, returned to the gritty, smoke-stained streets of his hometown, carrying with him the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and a tally of 17 confirmed kills that made him the most lethal aerial gunner in the history of the United States Air Force. But for Michael Arooth, the war did not end with a ticker-tape parade or the flashbulbs of a press conference. It ended in a state of profound, chilled disillusionment. He had spent his youth encased in a plexiglass cage at 30,000 feet, witnessing the systemic liquidation of his generation through the dark glass of a broken sight, and he had come to understand a truth that the propaganda machines in Washington would never dare to broadcast. To the American public, Arooth was a poster boy for ingenuity. The misfit from Massachusetts who had outthought the Luftwaffe and rewritten the manual on air defense. But in the private recesses of his mind, he was a man who had seen the gears of the meat grinder from the inside. He understood that his 17 kills were not merely statistics or swastikas painted onto the aluminum skin of a B-17. They were 17 individual human lives, 17 moments of fire and screaming metal that he had orchestrated from 900 yards away. He was an apex predator born from a broken system, a lethal anomaly who had been forced to become a butcher in order to avoid being the meat. When the journalists and the historians came knocking at his door in Springfield, looking for a dramatic retelling of the July 30th mission over Castle, Arooth met them with a wall of absolute silence. This was not the modest reticence of a humble soldier. It was a calculated rejection of a system that sought to own his trauma and convert it into a clinical set of tactical bullet points. He watched as the Pentagon declassified his early fire technique, sanitizing his raw, instinctive rebellion into a standardized doctrine for future generations of gunners. But they could never declassify the smell of cordite in his lungs or the sight of a German pilot's canopy shattering under his fire. The Arooth factor had become a permanent part of military science, a shift in the geometry of death that emphasized offensive dominance over defensive survival. But the man who had sparked that revolution refused to be its mascot. He realized that the same bureaucracy that now hailed him as a genius was the same one that had sent thousands of his friends to their deaths by insisting on the suicidal 600-yard rule. His silence was his final act of tactical treason, a refusal to let the systemic lies of the military-industrial complex claim his soul after they had already claimed his youth. He spent the rest of his life working quietly in the factories of Springfield, a man among machines who never spoke of the sky, never mentioned the sad sack, and never looked at a reflector sight again. He had seen through the illusion of the textbook and realized that in the mathematics of total war, there are no heroes, only survivors who were efficient enough to stay in the air and ghosts who were lost to the calculations of armchair generals. The psychological weight of the dead zone remained with him, a haunting reminder that his greatest accomplishment was rooted in a fundamental imbalance of power and a desperate need to break the rules. The legacy of Michael Arooth is not found in a Hollywood movie or a glossy biography because he refused to let them be written. His legacy is found in the hundreds of American bombers that didn't burn over Germany because their gunners learned to fire early, and in the quiet, dignified shadow of a man who chose anonymity over the hollow fame of the butcher's shop. In the final verdict of history, Arooth remains a chilling paradox, a man who proved that a broken sight could offer a clearer vision of the truth than the most advanced optics. He showed that in an age of industrial slaughter, the only hope for the individual is to recognize when the system has failed and to have the cold, predatory courage to act outside of it. As the B-17s were eventually towed to desert boneyards to rot under the sun, the story of the teenage gunner who turned the meat grinder back on its creators faded into the fog of the past, leaving behind only the cold, hard numbers of attrition and the memory of a boy from Springfield who looked into the abyss and decided he wouldn't die by the book. He died as he lived, in a state of defiant, lethal silence, a survivor who understood that the true cost of victory is a burden that can never be shared, only carried until the last engine stops and the sky finally goes dark. This is the final account of Michael Arooth, the lethal anomaly who saved the system by breaking its heart, and the legend who proved that sometimes the only way to see the truth is to look through a broken glass.